Okay, back. Okay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Emily Grijalva.
Introduction, it really is an observation that narcissism is unrelated to job performance. And this is not a consistent pattern. It's almost near zero. And this result has always really bothered me. It's not because I don't think it's true that narcissism is unrelated to job performance, and perhaps an underestimation, right? And it occurred to me, okay, it's unrelated to individual performance, team performance. Team performance is relevant because it relies on individuals' ability to establish interpersonal interconnections and develop a shared team. They're able to develop interpersonal interconnections and maintain positive working relationships over time. So I don't know if any of you guys have ever worked with a narcissist before on a team, but that really isn't one of their strengths, right? They're not known for being easygoing people that you want to continue to work with. So from my perspective, as a personality, as a narcissism researcher, it was really important to differentiate between narcissism's relationship with job performance at different levels. Personally, I don't want to work with a whole bunch of narcissists, and I want to be able to provide organizations with evidence that narcissists do actually hurt their bottom line. That's what they care about the most. And I was worried that at this point, the advice is basically, it's okay to hire narcissists as long as they're a high performer, which I just do not think is right. And ideally, they allow for more flexible division of labor. But not all teams function well together. I'm sure, I don't know about you guys, maybe not at Hogan, but if you think about your undergrad education, or at some point maybe you've been on a dysfunctional team. In the sports context, they've shown it's difficult to get those people to collaborate together effectively. And the 2004 U.S. Men's Olympic basketball team is a great example of this. This is kind of a classic example when you think about a team with a lot of soul, but that year they only brought performance. And when this kind of thing happens, I think a knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, maybe those players' egos got in the way of them being able to work together effectively. And despite this being a relatively common assumption, I was shocked by how little research has actually empirically examined this. So I wanted to know, all right, does team member narcissism actually interfere with implications for organizations? Because they can, to some extent, control the personality composition of the teams that they form. You can do this through selection and team assignment decisions. It just needs to be something that is made more salient to organizations. In terms of what we already know on this topic, it is well accepted, and this has been shown for a whole bunch of different personality variables like the Big Five. And when you look at it, theoretically what is really important, because teams are interdependent, is interpersonally relevant traits like narcissism. There's that theoretical match. They should be relevant to team performance. But despite that theoretical connection, again, there's not a whole bunch of research looking at narcissism itself. Narcissists tend to emerge as leaders in leaderless groups. That means that generally when you first meet a narcissist, or when you have a small discussion with them, they tend to be perceived as leader-like. So that's great. We also know, have been examining how narcissistic leaders are the teams that they lead. But what has been largely neglected is to look at how the configuration of team members' attributes on a team affects processes and performance. And so we're going to look in this project at how aggregate levels of narcissism affect coordination and performance. And to do this, in schools of management, theory is super important. And so there are two theories that simultaneously low in something called communion. Communion encompasses things like being nurturing, warm, and emotionally expressive. Be recognized for their achievements. That's incredibly important to them. But they don't have a strong need to get along with others. Maintaining healthy interpersonal relationships generally isn't a priority for them. And then I use this unique interpersonal structure and I tie it in with social exchange theory. So social exchange theory, I want to use that to predict how the interpersonal structure of narcissists affects any The interpersonal interactions unfold through a process of reciprocity. You kind of treat others the way they treat you. So if someone treats you negatively, you respond negatively in return. If they treat you positively, you reciprocate positively. So through the lens of this theory, for narcissism, we would expect that someone who's relatively egocentric would evoke selfish tendencies from other people in response. And this collaborative effort is particularly important. And if you have a shift towards focusing more on the interpersonal selfish needs, then you're going to do less for the collective, is basically the logic. So there might be a process of reciprocal egoism. Look at this and we measure it at a team level. This becomes a little bit more complicated. You have to figure out how to operationalize or measure itself that I talked about before, as well as social exchange theory, to land on the mean, the max, and core rule narcissism. And all of these are similar, and that the idea is if someone is more narcissistic, then they are more likely to evoke selfish tendencies in others, which are likely to spread throughout a team. However, the mean is unique in that it implicitly assumes that each member can impact the team basically equally. Whereas with the max, this approach is interesting because it looks at the most narcissistic member of a team. And the logic behind this approach is that one bad apple can spoil the barrel. And it's been shown with other personality traits that this is possible to happen. And you use it when it can be presumed that a single person's characteristics are actually more influential than others. A lot of the workflow goes through a person. They might be more central, influential, and important. And if that is the case, then their characteristics are more likely to set the interpersonal tone for the team. So does this kind of make sense up to this point? Okay. So overall, for each of these three different approaches to measuring narcissism, we think each. With narcissism, it's also an interesting trait because they're charismatic, they seem to be outgoing and energetic. I remember personally meeting someone at a party and thinking to myself, wow, I really want to be that person's friend. They seem someone like that. I'm immediately attracted to, not necessarily relationship-wise, but just I think they're a fun person. I kind of put them in a basket as someone who might be really super amazing, but I might also be a narcissist. And then over time, the more interpersonally toxic traits tend to emerge for narcissists. And those are things like I was talking about, being exploitative, entitled, and arrogant. And so there's kind of a change in their effects over time. We thought that this would be important to take into consideration because what it would mean is that you're more likely, and even researchers care about, is predicting team performance oftentimes. And coordination, it turns out, is one of the leading predictors of team performance. So, if a team is coordinating highly, then all of the members on the team are able to leverage each other's strengths. Whereas, if the team is suffering from lower coordination, there might be process losses that actually hurt team performance. And to make a really, a complicated thing simpler, you can think of this as being a causal sequence. So my prediction is that narcissism will hinder team coordination, which will in turn hurt team performance. And then finally, I look at this whole model together. So the idea here is that team-level narcissism will interact with team familiarity to affect team performance through coordination. So we're testing whether coordination transmits some of these effects. And that is the whole model, which I wanted to get through kind of quickly because I think one of the cooler things about this project is that it's a sports data project. And the way we tested this is we used National Basketball Association teams. But before I move on and describe all the details of my analysis to you, are there any questions about the model or anything I've put forward so far? All right. So we use NBA teams, and these are 30 teams in the US and Canada. And they are, in particular, we use the 2013-2014 regular season. And we used game by game. So we looked at it over time, longitudinally. Overall, there are 82 games for each of these 30 teams, so this resulted in actually 2,460 separate performance episodes that we were able to put into this database. And we argue that the NBA is well suited to look at this research question for quite a few different reasons. The first is that it potentially fans the flames of narcissism, because in this context, players are publicly celebrated. They have endorsement deals, media interviews, so it could activate latent narcissistic propensities. In addition, basketball is great. So one of my co-authors is the sports data expert here, and he was working on a project with the MLB with baseball teams. And so I went to him and I said, you know, your project sounds really interesting. Do you think there's something we could do with narcissism? And I kind of described the idea, and he said, what you really want are basketball teams, because basketball teams, the play is much more interdependent. In order for the team to be well, everyone on the team really has to be working well together. So that was one reason we chose this context. In addition, our reviewers pushed back on this initially, and so we really had to think carefully, why do we think narcissism will affect team performance in this context? And I think the number one reason is because you can think of possessing the basketball on the court as a limited resource. There are only 5 members of the team on the court at a time. Only one person can have the ball. And they have to decide if they're going to use that resource selfishly, if they're going to hog the ball, or if they are willing to actually use that and help the team as a whole. So if they're well defended, will they pass the ball to someone else who is not? In addition, you can look at how people choose to use their energy. That's also a limited resource that we have. Are they going to vigorously defend against opponents who are trying to score on them? Or are they going to really save their energy to focus on things that will get them more individual glory, such as scoring points? In addition, performance here is episodic, which is a fancy way of saying that we are able to measure 82 different games for each of these teams. So we can measure across the season as they become more familiar with one another, which is also useful for this model. And then finally, after we use personality surveys, there's always a question of social desirability biases, common method biases that arise. So these methodological issues that people are reporting themselves and their personality accurately. And so this is, in terms of performance, we can measure that objectively by using the coordination and scoring data from each game. In terms of the narcissism measure, which I'm sure people were wondering about because this is all great in terms of the actual performance data, but the narcissism data, I wish I were well connected enough to be able to go out and survey each team in the NBA, but that is simply not the case. So instead, we created our own measure. And this is actually my favorite thing about this project, is we sat down and we thought about how to create a Twitter measure of narcissism. We first thought carefully about how we wanted to pull the data down. So we wanted there to be causal priority, or to bolster claims of causal logic. And so we actually pulled down the Twitter data before the season started, is the key thing to note here. It was after the draft and before the regular season for 2013-2014. Most of the players, interestingly, actually did have Twitter accounts, and so that was also useful. Overall, we had 2 different, and then another thing that makes Twitter awesome for measuring narcissism is you can think of it as being a great context that would attract narcissists, because it allows them to instantly connect with a whole network of followers. And overall, we had 2 different measures that we combined to create an overall measure of narcissism. The first is we looked at the percentage of tweets for each player that were considered to be narcissistic. And we did this based on content coding. And I'll describe that more in a moment. And then the second is that we rated their Twitter profile pictures. And then we standardized those, summed them for overall measure. In terms of the content coding, for the period in question, that couple of months before the season started, there were 91,000 tweets in our sample. And we were trying to make this more manageable, so we decided, all right, we'll cut this down by capping it at the median for each player. The median was 134 tweets. If people had more than 134, we took a random sample of all their tweets and coded them. The fewer, we just coded all of them. Then the next step was to create a detailed coding guide. We based it on the definition of narcissism. We trained 4 different raters to use the guide in a 4-hour session. And then they did 320 hours of additional coding. And we wanted this to be as systematic as possible and make sure the quality of the coding was high. So what we did is we did it over the summer, and we paid people hourly wages, and we had them like it was an intense endeavor for them. They ended up rating 20% of the tweets as being narcissistic. And then here is an example of one of the tweets. So they took a photo of themselves looking in the mirror. What do you think when you look in the mirror? Greatness. Yeah.
Did you withhold names of the people's tweets when you were coding them?
We did. Well, to some extent, we didn't tell our readers what the research question was. We didn't purposefully tell them the names, but at the same time, we also had to give them access to go look up additional information about people, about the account. So for example, they'd have to be able to go onto Twitter and look and see, okay, if this was just a tweet here, I think you could code it as being narcissistic, but sometimes you need context. When we actually pulled all the information down from the web, some of the pictures didn't come in, some of the emojis didn't come in, and so they actually would go on and look additional information up. We didn't select people who are necessarily particularly familiar with the players though. So we didn't select someone who's an expert in basketball and already knew a whole bunch of information about each of these players. Yeah?
Did you just code tweets or also like replies to other people's tweets? So like people getting like in a Twitter battle or something?
That's a good question. We just coded the tweets from them. Yeah?
Did you find any relationship between the people who were rated more narcissistic and the total number of tweets that they have?
Yes, we did. I don't know what it was off the top of my head. We actually used that as our initial measure, the tweeting volume, because other researchers have shown that that is really relatively highly correlated with narcissism. The more you tweet, the more narcissistic you are. So that was our initial measure, and reviewers said, that's great, but we really want you to go in and content code. And so then that's why we did the 320 hours of work, but I do think that it allowed us to get a more nuanced measure of narcissism. Any other questions? For the profile pictures, the idea here is that people could pick any photo of themselves for their profile. So theoretically, their dominant characteristics should appear in those pictures. And then in addition to that, there's been research that shows you can rate someone's personality relatively accurately from a photo. For narcissists, the kind of thing that you look for is if they have a relatively dominant, self-confident facial expression or body language, as well as indications of vanity. So are they wearing brand new clothing? Do they have their hair done really nicely? Do they look neat and well put together? All these things factor into an initial impression we have of someone. But a picture is worth 1,000 words. So here is an example of a very high narcissism profile picture. This is Udonis Haslam. We didn't actually name players in our article because we felt it was a little mean. So you guys are getting to see something that we didn't even show to reviewers. So here is a great example because he is actually taking photos of himself with his trophies. He took multiple photos and compiled them together so that you could get multiple views of his body. He took his shirt off. Another example here is Carmelo Anthony. Here I think it's also highly narcissistic. He has a very confident, dominant body language. He's power posing basically. And he is also wearing very fashionable clothing. Jewelry, a hat, in front of a crowd of adoring fans, perhaps. Or just a crowd that happened to be there. And next, these are pictures that are lower in narcissism. So these are pictures of people's families, their dogs. Sometimes we'd actually have to go out and try to figure out what people look like because there were 500 players in our data set. A lot of times when people think of the NBA, they think of really famous players, but the majority of the people in the data set were not very famous. This made me incredibly self-conscious though about social media, I have to say. So after this, I just got rid of everything. I would always be thinking, is this a narcissistic post? I don't know. I can't decide anymore, so I'm not doing it. In addition, so I think it's relatively face valid that Twitter would be related to narcissism. And there's also research showing this. But we wanted to provide a validation sample as well. So a sample that in fact tends to suggest, okay, a survey measure of narcissism correlates with our Twitter measure. So we set out to do that. We collected a separate sample of participants. These were not NBA players, they were just normal everyday people that we got from Twitter and Facebook, and we asked them to provide some personality data as well as their Twitter handle. And then we went online, we scraped the web, pulled down all their Twitter, their tweets, their profile picture, created the same measure of narcissism that we did for the NBA players, and coded another, because we hadn't coded enough, almost 5,000 tweets. And it turned out that there was a relatively strong correlation between the narcissistic personality inventory, which is the most commonly used measure of personality, or of narcissism, and our Twitter measure. So I should say it's statistically significant. In terms of strength, we kind of had to go out and decide, how do we know if this is big or small? It's technically moderate. And so I found this review article that someone had published in which they compiled a lot of information from different studies that used unobtrusive measures and then correlated those with personality surveys that were supposed to be assessing the same thing. And those range from 0.14 to 0.34. Our measure here is 0.31, so it's at the very high end of the range there. And I think there are lots of reasons why you would think that an unobtrusive measure would have a smaller correlation with a survey than two survey measures of supposedly the same thing would have with one another. There's this really well-accepted thing called comment method bias that tends to inflate correlations if you use similar methodologies. So anyway, this, we thought, supported the use of our Twitter scale. One last thing I want to point out about measuring narcissism is that when we looked at the core role player in this context, we used point guards because these were the players who were responsible for initiating both offensive and defensive plays. So in this way, the point guard is a relatively central, important member of the team. For coordination, we specifically looked at assists. These are passes that lead directly to a made field goal. They're situations where players work together to score points. For team familiarity, we looked at the game of the season. Each team, as I mentioned, played 82 games, so we assumed they became more familiar throughout the season. For performance, we looked at whether the team won or lost, because ultimately that is the most important thing for each of these teams. But we also wanted a more nuanced measure, so we looked at victory margin, and the results were almost exactly the same. And we had a whole bunch of control variables. We started out with a whole bunch, and then reviewers asked us to have even more, and so we did. We controlled for the home team advantage that I think we're all kind of familiar with. The pace of a game. If a game is faster paced, then it affects how many coordination and performance opportunities you have. We looked at opponent offensive and defensive quality. The average age of players, because it turns out narcissism tends to decrease as we age. In addition to that, we thought it might be related to social media use, where older players might not be as comfortable with Twitter. And then we looked at stage of the season effects. The idea that as the stakes get higher, some of these things might change. So we looked at whether teams had qualified for the playoffs or been eliminated from the playoffs. And then I skipped one, which was prior familiarity, which was incredibly important. Because players might have played with each other on that team in previous seasons or on a different team. And so we actually controlled for that by going out and again doing a ton of work to figure out how many games each player had played with every other player on the team throughout their entire NBA career. And then we looked at the average ability of each of the players on the team. So we did this using estimated wins added. So if you are a basketball expert or interested in basketball, you've probably heard of this. It's a very common way of assessing performance. So you look at the number of wins a player adds above that of an average replacement player. Are there any questions at this point?
Are you able to capture like to what degree like team makeup changed? Like I think it might somehow be in the familiarity, but like say if a key player was traded in the middle of the season.
Yeah.
After that.
So we actually assessed each of, so like the narcissism was different in each game depending who was playing. And then this gets really complicated because we wanted to go even further. And we actually weighted this by minutes played for each player in each game to make sure the measure was as accurate as possible. And we did that for each of the narcissism measures as well as average age and performance to make sure that we thought it was important because that would hurt to us too that players might be traded.
So did you connect the minutes played to how much time they had on average the ball in their hand?
We did not. So the minutes played was just the number of minutes that they were in the game, not the number of minutes that they possessed the ball. To perform our analyses, we use generalized estimating equations to control for the non-nested non-independence that we observed in our data set. And there are all kinds of non-independence. The first was that there were 2 teams associated with each game. And then each team also played 82 different games. And in addition to that, sometimes the teams played each other more than once. So we tried to control for all this non-independence, which can bias your results. We use Grandview and SPSS. So finally, what you guys have all been waiting for, what you came for is some data, right? First, this is the table for mean narcissism. And all the effect sizes have been standardized. Model 1 just looks at our control variables. What you're most interested in here is Model 2. This looks at narcissism's relationship with coordination. And yay! Our hypothesis was supported. It turns out if a team has a higher average level of narcissism, that tends to lead to fewer assists. It hurts their coordination. And this becomes stronger, it's exacerbated as the season unfolds, which is shown here by this interaction. So just to show you a little bit what the interaction looks like, I plotted this at plus and minus 1 standard deviation. And you can see that for high familiarity teams, or for narcissism, it had a negative relationship with coordination for high familiarity teams. So this is what we were looking at, this is what we hypothesized. But you're finding it mainly in the high familiarity context. This means the latter part of the season is when it's going to be the strongest. Whereas with the low familiarity teams, there is no relationship between narcissism and coordination. So So this is really important, right? If you were to look at a team at a single point in time, and you weren't to capture it longitudinally at multiple time points, you might draw the wrong conclusion or an inaccurate conclusion, because if you just look at after a team is immediately formed or just formed, you might conclude there is no relationship. However, one thing I wanted to point out is that although the interaction is significant, it is a little bit different than we initially hypothesized. And that is because what I thought would be happening is that narcissists would be poisoning the relationship on a team. So that you would start out with a level of coordination and that would decrease over time. But this is fascinating. What we're finding is that the highly narcissistic teams have almost the same level of coordination over time. Where you're really getting the change is for the low narcissism teams. These teams are able to capitalize, to take advantage of getting to know one another, trusting one another, realizing what players' strengths and weaknesses are. And so this is really where these teams are able to differentiate themselves, the low narcissism teams. Whereas you can think of the high narcissism teams as almost stagnated. They're not able to really begin to trust each other or leverage their shared experiences. For the max, we also found that if you have a higher level of maximum narcissism on your team, it tends to hurt coordination. This is again the idea that a bad apple spoils the barrel. But we didn't find that this effect got stronger over time. We found that it was always there. And then finally, for core role narcissism, keep in mind this was if you have a more narcissistic point guard on the team, that also hurts team coordination. And that becomes stronger over time as well. If you look at the shape of this interaction, it's very similar to the one I just showed you for the mean, which is always nice. Things are functioning kind of systematically. We found that narcissism's relationship with coordination was negative in high familiarity contexts, and then in low familiarity contexts, it was not statistically significant. Oh, and I was just going to say, yeah, the form of the interaction is the same. Here, the high narcissism teams have exactly the same coordination over time almost, whereas the low narcissism teams, that's where you're really seeing the change or the improvement in coordination. That the high narcissism teams, or the teams with the point guard who is higher, are not able to get. It also turns out for each of these different measures of narcissism, the effects on performance are transmitted through coordination. So higher narcissism leads to poor coordination, and that in turn hurts performance. And then finally, our whole model altogether, we are able to show that the interaction between narcissism and familiarity is again transmitted through coordination for the mean and the core role. We didn't even bother testing this for the max, however, because we didn't find the significant interaction there. So it didn't make sense. Alright, so statistical significance is awesome. We all love it, right? But I wanted to put this in terms that are a little bit easier to understand for you. And one way to think about this is that as familiarity increases over the course of the season, the lower narcissism teams, the increases in coordination that they're experiencing are being translated into winning 3 more games in the latter half of the season as compared to the beginning. And this might not sound like very many additional wins, but if you're familiar with basketball, you know that the teams at the margin for making the playoffs, a single win can make a huge difference. And this happened to be the case in the 2013-2014 season as well. In terms of the final qualifying team to the next team below them that did not qualify, there was only 1 win difference. And so my argument here is that the difference in coordination between the high and low narcissism teams is something that has a substantial real-world impact on the teams. And you can also see this by looking at an example of the least narcissistic team was the Charlotte Bobcats in 2013-2014. They were projected by expert odds makers to have 26 wins, which would have made them one of the worst teams in the league. But they dramatically outperformed expectations. They had 43 wins, and they made the playoffs. And you compare this to the most narcissistic teams, the New York Knicks. They were projected to have 49 wins, be one of the best teams in the league. They only had 37, and they did not make the playoffs. So this team dramatically underperformed relative to expectations based on talent alone. And so this anecdote helps us showcase a very important point that I want to make, and that is that experts, odds makers, these people are very good at being able to come up with an idea of what an individual's talent level is, and then sum those together to come up with an overall expectation of a team's performance for the season. But if they're exclusively basing that on talent and not taking into consideration more intangible attributes, then they're opening themselves up to prediction errors. And in fact, this is something that is likely not only true of sports data experts, but also everyday managers. If they over-rely on talent and they don't pay enough attention to things like narcissism and tangible attributes, then they again can make some of these prediction errors in putting together a team. So my foremost piece of practical advice for practitioners is that you need to consider narcissism when you're making selection decisions and you're making assignment decisions. And you also need to proactively monitor that over time. And that is particularly true for core roles on a team. Leadership roles are roles that are particularly central, where a lot of the workflow and communication has to go through a single individual. You need to make sure that that individual is the type of person you want to set the interpersonal tone for a team. That might seem like common sense, right? But narcissists really they strive to obtain positions of power and influence and prestige. And so they are going to be the ones that are self-nominating for these types of positions. And a manager has to take that into consideration. If they capitulate to those types of demands, then they might face long-term performance problems in that team. So overall, what is the contribution, or what are the contributions of this paper? This is one of the first papers on this topic to look at aggregate levels of narcissism and how they work in tandem with team processes to affect team performance. And the idea here was to provide a more nuanced interpretation of how narcissism affects organizational performance. Up to this point, it had kind of just been assumed that narcissism wasn't strongly related to performance because of the individual level effect. And I wanted to be able to say to organizations, no, that is not the whole story. There are situations when narcissists do hurt organizational performance, particularly when they are in an interpersonal context. It affects how they work or are able to work with other people. Another contribution I thought was interesting is the nature of this interaction that we found. The fact that it wasn't that narcissists are causing decreases in coordination, but they're preventing teams from being able to build positive interpersonal relationships and trust and get normative gains in coordination that most teams experience as they work together over a longer period of time. I thought that was fascinating, and I hope additional research follows that up and looks at that more carefully to try and figure out what's going on there. And then finally, one of the things I mentioned that I think is the coolest about this paper is our novel Twitter measure of narcissism. I'm hoping that other researchers will also begin to use that, particularly in situations when they might not have access to survey data. If you want to look at CEOs, for example, there might be some industries where you could get CEOs who tweet. Like any other project, this paper had some limitations. We were restricted here to, I think it's a strength and a weakness that our project was restricted to using the Twitter measure of narcissism. We did, of course, validate it, and it has some advantages because it is less prone to social desirability and common method bias. But I'm also hopeful that future researchers will look at this with survey measures as well to increase that generalizability. The fact that we used an NBA sample, again, has pros and cons. It's great that you have objective performance data spread out over time and teams, but I also would love to see this replicated in other teams. The NBA is considered what we call action teams, which means the type of tasks they perform tend to be psychomotor or manual, rather than intellective tasks. So if I were to think about what kinds of teams, it would be other teams that are relatively action teams, like military units, for example, where they're performing relatively physical activities on the job. Other people have compared the NBA to other entertainment action teams, like orchestra or the cast of a play. But generally, what I'm hopeful for is that other people will go out and do more research and really figure out where this is able to generalize, where it's not. And then, of course, the timeline of our familiarity effects can be more precisely pinpointed as well. This is something that tends to accumulate over multiple studies and multiple contexts. But it is important to realize that familiarity is an important variable to take into consideration. So, if you're interested in this project, then it is currently in press. You can go and download the paper and get all of the details about our study. I posted it on ResearchGate. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but so you should just be able to go on and download it. And I want to give a shout out to my other co-authors on this project, without whom it would not have been possible. So my second author here is Tim Maines. He's also an assistant professor at the University of Buffalo. And he has another really cool project that looks at MLB teams that it would also potentially be interesting. My graduate student, Katie Badura, very proud of her. She just finished her dissertation and got a job at Georgia Tech. And then finally, my third co-author is Steve Whiting. He's at the University of Central Florida. So, thank you all for coming. Come on. Well, I'm glad that didn't happen earlier. There's a thank you slide. Oh. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming here today on a Friday afternoon and listening to me talk about my research. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Yeah.
I believe Kimberly warned you that I asked a couple questions. Do you think, your last item I thought was interesting about action teams, so what would you hypothesize would happen in non-action teams? Think this effect would be stronger?
To me, I think the most important characteristic here is the interdependence of the NBA. The fact that you can't just leave one member out and have an equally effective team. What I would look for in terms of generalizability would also be the interdependence. So I should have said that, and I meant to say that as well. But I think in terms of the actual tasks being performed, I'm hopeful that we experience generalizability across intellective groups as well. And I know I kind of see it with my undergraduate groups that of teams that I put together in MBA or undergrad classes, where some of those totally derailed because of some problematic, potentially narcissism levels on the team. And that's an intellective task.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Because there's so many games, it's kind of, you can see the practical effect at the end, make a good argument for that. Are there do you have any examples of other teams that you may be able to see that effect show itself in a practical sense, like in the workplace, where there are 80, a lot of times teams come together, do something, and then break apart, come back, do something else. It's not always the same task.
Mm-hmm. And it's not always the same people.
Yeah.
It might be something, we were thinking about consulting teams where even though you might break apart and come together, you do work together for longer periods of time sometimes, and then, 3 months, 6 months, and then repeatedly over years, where then it might become increasingly annoying over time.
Familiarity will
Yeah, accrue over time. there's something interesting called the clean slate effect, where when you break apart for a period of time, you kind of reset your expectations, and you can think about this as the off season of a basketball team being similar to kind of breaking apart from a team. And we didn't capture this because we looked at it as a full season, but I do think it would like, over time it'd just be harder to assess if you don't have a starting point. Yeah.
Well, two questions, but both are pretty much yes or no. Did you see a correlation? I'm interested because the Knicks were at the top, or they're the most narcissistic. So was there a correlation based on kind of the sexiness of the market? Because free agents tend to gravitate toward those markets. So whenever they're looking to maybe move to a different team,
Right.
that I don't know. I just wondered if there was, because there's more appeal to a New York City than maybe there is in Oklahoma City.
Oh, okay, so I'm not sure if this is, I don't think this is assessing your question, so I'll try, I'm gonna answer this way, and then you can tell me how I can pinpoint my answer more specifically. But I also looked, in addition to the core role, we looked at player salary, because we thought the core role might not be the only way that you could look at a player being influential, so we wanted to capture something more aligned with status of the players. And we actually found similar results to the core role, except we didn't find the main effect for salary. We found the interaction between salary and team familiarity. And that is in the paper, but that was kind of a follow-up analysis a reviewer recommended that we do, which I thought was important and interesting. So that kind of getting at?
Kind of. I'm more interested, were the Lakers in the top 5?
I don't know.
All right. The second question is, has this sparked any interest from general managers around the league yet?
It hasn't. I've been surprised. We had someone from ESPN contact us and wanted to learn more about the project. We're waiting for them to follow up with us again. I tried to get more media interest. I thought there'd be a ton of media interest in this, and so I tried to get some by publishing in an outlet called The Conversation. So there, if you're interested, you could go find a short blurb about the piece, but no general managers have contacted me yet, unfortunately. That'd be awesome, because then maybe I could do a follow-up study somehow, yeah.
Out of curiosity, is your content coding scheme available through the paper or something?
It's not, but you can contact me and I could kind of walk you through it. I have this really detailed file that I created with the instructions for the coders.
Is it, out of curiosity, is it specific enough for it to potentially be automated, like especially from the Twitter aspect, like natural language processing?
Yes, so that is something other people have asked me about as well. And it's definitely something that I think we could work towards. It was surprisingly, it took a surprising amount of individual attention to code each tweet because it's relatively complex. More so than something like positive and negative affect, to try and figure out if a tweet is someone trying to gain admiration from others. So we look at things like, for example, if they're tweeting about a charity, is it a charity with their name? Is it a company that they profit from? Is it, if not, is it just a charity that they're trying to go out and do good in the world? So if it's the latter, we wouldn't code it as narcissism. If it's the former, we kind of, depending on the situation, code it as narcissism. So we had lots of coding rules, and it was kind of complicated. I gave the data to a finance professor in the School of Management, and he tried to play with it and really quickly do something along the lines of what you were suggesting, and nothing really panned out. But I think it's definitely possible as technology continues to get smarter. Yeah?
Did you happen to look at the relationship between player salary and your Twitter measures? I was just wondering to what extent are you capturing maybe just, I don't know,
Well, we
their
did-
salary, their success, like if you're
Yeah.
putting pictures for having nice clothing, like that could just be a function of your.
I don't remember it off the top of my head. I can look that up later, but we did control for their performance, which would be what I would think is the fundamental factor you're talking about by estimated wins added. And interestingly, when we included a control for their performance, it didn't really affect their results very much. There was, I did include this, sorry. Now it's been like 4 months since I published this, but I'm on to the clean slate has occurred and I'm on to a new project. But there was a relationship between individual performance and narcissism, which is kind of a different question. But I thought that was in itself was interesting because you don't often find that, like I said in the first slide. And when we controlled for minutes played, it disappeared. So it's almost like these people are pressuring their managers to play them, even though they're not any better.
Yeah.
And once you take that out of consideration, the opportunity to score more points, have more assists, that kind of thing, then they're the same as other players.
Well, I really didn't mean in the model, components of the model, I meant more just as an evaluation of the Twitter measure of narcissism.
Yeah, so we found that it is related to performance, even though we didn't want it to be. And then we looked more deeply and we were like, okay, well, if we control for the opportunity to influence play by playing time, then we no longer find that. And so I think what you would maybe hope for is it's not strongly correlated with performance, just given that that is the meta-analytic or the average finding across studies. But there is some variance there as well. Yeah.
This would be kind of an ignorant question, but did you consider someone having a PR manager or like is that?
Oh yeah, no, that is not an ignorant question. We get that a lot. Yeah, so we did. We always looked to see if someone was signing their initials for tweeting with them. And then we took into account the fact that most of these people actually are not that famous. They're not being paid an exorbitant amount the way you would expect from LeBron James or someone very famous to be rewarded. It is always possible that someone, to some extent, might have someone tweet for them, but I would guess that they would still want that person to be a reflection of them.
Yeah.
And I don't know very many people who actually give up control of Twitter. Even our US president tweets for himself because it is such a personal outlet. Oh, and then we also looked at content. We also looked at the content and like, does it seem like they're able to say inappropriate things? And it did. Like, it didn't seem like someone was out there